Elections have consequences, and one of the biggest consequences of this latest election, halting the march toward World War III. Here's the problem. Permanent Washington has said they don't care. They don't care what voters want, and they're going to continue that march. I'm Ben Swann. This is Truth in Media.
We have never been closer to World War III than we are today under Joe Biden.
It is outrageous. In fact, it is treasonous. You just heard President-elect Donald Trump responding to news that the Biden White House has greenlit another round of ATACMS missile strikes, this time hitting deep inside Russian soil. These are missiles that will be fired from Ukraine deep into the heart of Russia, something that the Biden administration refused to okay during the nearly 3 years that this war has gone on. And now that Biden has only 60 or so days left in office, he approves it. The reaction? Completely justified, because the consequences of this will extend far beyond the current administration's last days in office. Immediately, we saw lawmakers and even George Soros' son celebrating this news on Twitter. And what the hell are they celebrating? More dead people? Because the truth is, they have absolutely no shame here. No matter how you slice it, this move will lead to many, many more dead people, an increase in war, and potentially the launch of nuclear strikes between Russia and the West. And all of that could potentially lead to the deaths of millions of people. And yet Washington has no problem with that at all. That's what we're hearing. In fact, Republicans on Capitol Hill, they are starting to believe that Biden is setting Trump up for World War III. And that's why Trump is now calling for a leadership change, and he wants it now. Listen.
But we need new leadership. Every day this proxy battle in Ukraine continues, we risk global war. We must be absolutely clear that our objective is to immediately have a total cessation. In addition, there must also be a complete commitment to dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment that is perpetually dragging us into endless wars, pretending to fight for freedom and democracy abroad.
Trump is exactly right there, pretending to fight for freedom abroad. They are not. And do you blame his anger there? What the current administration is doing is making decisions not only to hurt Donald Trump, but to hurt the American people. As I mentioned before, if World War III breaks out, millions of lives could be lost. And more importantly, and here is the kicker, the American people voted overwhelmingly to stop this very thing. The election 2 weeks ago was a loud rebuke of these wars. And you know why? In large part, this administration and Kamala Harris lost because they refused to listen to or act according to the will of the people. For a group that is constantly talking about democracy, the democratic process of voting for change in this policy is being completely ignored. One thing is absolutely for certain. We need de-escalation, and we need it now, or we will find ourselves on the wrong side of history. And joining us now to discuss all this is Dave Smith. He is a libertarian, commentator, comedian. He is a politician. Dave, you've had your thumb on this for a long time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. Big fan, Ben.
Likewise. So let's talk about this because, we saw this news over the weekend. I guess I wasn't surprised to hear it, but deeply disappointed that this is happening, right? Because as I mentioned, the American people have made their voices heard. They have voted against this stuff. Trump has been outwardly calling for the end to this, and yet we see a ramping up of this war effort in Ukraine, unlike anything that's happened over the past 3 years. Why was it okay for Biden to tell Ukraine you couldn't fire missiles into Russia up until 60 days before he leaves office, and he says, go for it now, it's fine?
Yeah, it is unbelievably reckless. I mean, and that's just like an understatement. But even in the entire history of the Cold War, the first Cold War, there was never anything like this. Even when it was a declared emergency and we had to go all around the world, trying to undermine communist influence or fighting wars in Korea or Vietnam, nobody was ever so reckless as to support strikes, long-range strikes in Russia with U.S. weapons, because even back then, there was some appreciation for the profound risk to the annihilation of humanity. And, if you actually study the history of it, we came very dangerously close to that risk multiple times during the first Cold War. This is just, it's unbelievable. And, to your point, like the greatest living American hero, Ron Paul, would always say that essentially the American people have never gotten to have a say on this. And they almost always vote for the more anti-war candidate when it comes to presidents. It was a huge advantage for Barack Obama against Hillary Clinton that he hadn't voted for the war in Iraq. And then, of course, he destroyed the war hawk John McCain. Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton because he was the anti-war candidate compared to her. And this happens over and over again. And yet it doesn't, for the people who shriek about democracy the loudest, they don't seem to care at all that the American people have no interest in risking nuclear war over whether Luhansk is ruled by Kiev or Moscow. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Even when you know how corrupt and war hungry DC is, this one is truly shocking.
It really is. And something that the viewers may not understand about these ATACMS missiles, right? They cannot be operated by the Ukrainians. The system is set up in a way that it has to be U.S. soldiers who are on the ground and U.S. soldiers who are firing them from Ukraine. This is what happened when those same missiles were fired a few months ago, remember, and they hit some different areas in Crimea along the beach. And one of the things that the Russians pointed out at the time was they said, look, we know that it's the U.S. who's firing these. So the idea that these missiles would be allowed to be fired deep into Ukraine means that we are admitting we are going to use U.S. military to fire U.S. missiles from Ukraine into Russia. If there is not a greater provocation for nuclear war, I don't know what else there would be.
Right. And think about the standard that the war hawks use on their enemies. So if the U.S. invades Iraq, and then some Shiites, fire some missiles and hit a U.S. base. Well, that's Iran. Iran is now responsible, or Bashar al-Assad is now responsible. Whatever regime we want to overthrow is now, we consider that a direct act of war, even though it was an illegal invasion halfway around the world, and nobody can really defend that our troops should be there at all. And yet, in this example, like if we, apply the same standard, well, then what are we looking at here? We're looking at the United States of America declaring war on Russia, the holders of the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the history of the world. And again, over what? Over what? Over bringing Ukraine into NATO? Like what? There's not even, at least with,
that hasn't even happened. But that hasn't even happened. They're not going into NATO. No one's even including them in NATO. So yeah, to your point, yes, we keep talking about like NATO and protecting them, and yet NATO won't even allow Ukraine in. So what are we going to war for?
Well, and look, I mean, this was Vladimir Putin's perspective, and he's wrong about a whole lot of things, but this one is pretty reasonable. Yeah. Is that he essentially determined that in effect Ukraine had been brought into NATO, and it's hard over the last couple years to really argue with that. I mean, we've done every bit as much as we would be required to do under Article 5.4, a NATO ally in Ukraine, and the NATO's military was already doing joint exercises with the Ukrainian military before the invasion in 22, and so yeah, we've essentially, at least with say the war in Iraq. Obviously, the whole thing was sold off lies, but if the lies were true, then you could see there being a justification for invading. Like if Saddam Hussein had been in on 9/11 and had nuclear weapons and was about to pass them off to terrorists, then you could see the logic in why we have to invade the country. Now, all of that, of course, was lies, but in this war, even if all the lies were true, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no reason why we would have to be in this position. And especially seeing as how this thing's been done forever, for so long now. There's nobody even, but at the beginning, Nancy Pelosi was saying, we're going to take Crimea back to Ukraine. No one believes this anymore. No. This is just not happening. So we're risking nuclear war for nothing.
Well, and maybe not for nothing, right? Maybe it is all about, hey, we can pin Trump in and we can force him to keep paying out these contracts, right? These hundreds of $billions in contracts that have been awarded to military contractors. Last question for you on this, and that is, what should the Trump administration do? You can't do much because you're not in power right now. But should Trump pick up the phone and call Putin and say, don't respond, don't react, and if you can hold off for 60 days and not take the bait, which I think Putin, as you said, there's a lot of bad things about this guy. I think he's pretty smart, though, and smart enough to not take the bait here. Don't take the bait, and then what? We'll just give you Ukraine afterwards, or whatever it is, right? But what do they tell him to say, stand down for 60 days, no matter what these guys try to do to provoke you? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially it right there, and that's really why that video address was so important from Donald Trump. But absolutely, I mean, I don't, maybe he doesn't have to be the one who gets on the phone with Putin, but one of his guys should get on the phone with Sergei Lavrov or something. Somebody should be talking. But that should be the message that, like, look, it's pretty clear what they're trying to do is box me in to have to fight this war, but we're willing to negotiate on day one. And I hopefully that message can be enough. And the truth is that, there were these articles, I'm sure you saw them, that came out right after election day, where it was like Putin ready to negotiate, Hamas ready to negotiate. And a lot of Trump supporters were selling this almost as if it's because Donald Trump is just so star-spangled awesome that once he gets in there, everybody's ready to come to the table. Yeah. The truth is, for anyone who's been paying attention, they've been ready to negotiate. The impediment to peace
2 months into the war.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So Vladimir Putin, and even before the war, at least according to the head of NATO, whose name I always butcher, Stoltenberg, yep. He said that Vladimir Putin said, I won't invade if you put it in writing that you'll never bring Ukraine into NATO. And he bragged about how they said, no, we're not going to do that because we won't let you bully us into that. And this is after hundreds of thousands of people have died in the conflict. So great win. No, but to your point, that was an important correction. There is a point to it for the weapons companies. There is a point to it for a lot of people who are making enormous amounts of money off this war.
They are the ones who benefit. Dave Smith, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Ben.
And that is our show. You can catch all of our latest coverage. Check us out on X at @truth_media and watch all of our full episodes at truthandmedia.com.